The morning of June 6, 1944, broke cold and grey over the beaches of Normandy, France. Among the thousands of soldiers preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, one man stood apart, not because he wanted to, but because the United States Army had tried everything possible to keep him from being there. Medical officers had examined him repeatedly, declaring him physically unfit for combat. His superiors had assigned him to labor battalions, cooking duties, anything to keep him away from the front lines. What they saw was a black soldier with a body that, according to their examinations, could not withstand the rigors of warfare. What they could not see was the fire burning inside Corporal James Henderson of the 29th Infantry Division, a determination so fierce that it would soon rewrite the rules of what one human being could accomplish when everything and everyone said it was impossible. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a man deemed medically unfit for service would single-handedly neutralize 9 fortified German defensive positions in a single day, changing the course of the invasion and forcing the military establishment to confront truths they had spent decades denying. James Henderson was born in 1922 in rural Mississippi, the fourth of 7 children in a sharecropping family that worked land they would never own. From childhood, his body had betrayed certain weaknesses: a heart murmur detected by a traveling doctor when he was 8, chronic respiratory issues that left him wheezing after heavy exertion, and a skeletal frame that seemed too slight to carry the weight that farm work demanded. Yet Henderson possessed something that medical examinations could not measure: an absolute refusal to be defined by limitation. The Henderson family worked cotton fields that stretched for miles under the brutal Mississippi sun. James learned early that physical work was survival, that showing weakness meant getting less food, fewer opportunities, diminished respect. He watched his older brothers collapse from heat exhaustion during harvest season, saw his father's body slowly break down from decades of backbreaking labor. He understood that his own physical limitations made him vulnerable in a world that measured worth in pounds lifted and acres plowed. So he developed strategies. He learned to pace himself, to work methodically rather than explosively, to conserve energy for the moments that demanded maximum effort. He studied the most efficient ways to perform tasks, minimizing wasted motion. While his brothers relied on raw strength, James relied on technique and endurance. By the time he was 15, he could outwork men twice his size over the course of a full day, not because he was stronger, but because he was smarter about how he used his strength. The sharecropping system in Mississippi during the 1930s was designed to keep families in perpetual debt. The landowners controlled the accounts, set the prices, determined what the crop was worth. No matter how hard the Henderson family worked, they ended each season owing more than they had earned. James understood from an early age that physical labor alone would never break this cycle. Education was the only escape, but schools for black children in rural Mississippi were open only a few months each year, staffed by underpaid teachers with inadequate resources. James attended school whenever he could, walking 6 miles each way when the school was in session. He read everything he could find, borrowing books from the small library maintained by a local church. He was particularly drawn to stories of achievement and innovation, accounts of people who had overcome obstacles through intelligence and determination. He read about Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, and other black Americans who had made significant contributions despite systemic barriers. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, James was 19 years old and working in a Birmingham steel mill, one of the few industrial jobs available to black workers in the segregated South. The mill work was brutal: 12-hour shifts in heat that reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit, lifting materials that weighed upwards of 80 pounds, breathing air thick with metallic dust. His supervisors noticed that Henderson never complained, never slowed, never asked for the lighter duties that his slight frame might have justified. He simply worked, methodically and relentlessly, as if proving something to invisible judges. The steel mill was a revelation to Henderson. Unlike the agricultural work he had known, industrial work had clear metrics of productivity. He could see exactly how much steel he processed, how his output compared to others, how efficiency could be improved through better technique. He studied the production process, learned the properties of different metals, understood the relationships between temperature, pressure, and material strength. This knowledge would prove invaluable in ways he could not anticipate. The draft notice arrived in March 1942. Henderson reported to the induction center in Montgomery, Alabama, where he joined hundreds of other black men in a processing system designed to channel them away from combat roles. The military of that era operated under deeply entrenched assumptions about race and capability. Black soldiers were considered suitable for labor, supply, and support functions, but combat was reserved for white units. The justification was dressed in pseudo-scientific language about physical and mental aptitudes, but the reality was simple racial prejudice codified into military policy. Henderson's medical examination should have ended his military service before it began. The examining physician, Captain Morris Blackwell, noted the heart murmur, the respiratory weakness, and a body weight of only 138 pounds stretched over a 5'10" frame. Blackwell's report recommended classification as 4F, medically unfit for military service. But Henderson did something unexpected. He requested a second examination, arguing that he had worked in conditions more demanding than military service could possibly offer. The request was unusual enough that it reached the desk of Colonel Franklin Pierce, the base medical officer. Pierce was intrigued by the audacity and approved a second examination under more rigorous conditions. Henderson was subjected to a full day of physical testing, running, climbing, carrying weighted packs, endurance marches. The medical staff expected him to fail decisively, providing clear justification for the original assessment. Instead, Henderson performed at levels that shocked the observers. His mile run time was 8 minutes and 42 seconds, faster than 70% of the men who had been cleared for full combat duty. On the weighted march, carrying 45 pounds for 5 miles, he finished in the top quartile. His heart murmur remained detectable. His breathing was labored, but his performance was undeniable. The examining officers watched in confusion as this supposedly unfit soldier outperformed men they had already certified as combat-ready. Pierce faced a dilemma. The data contradicted the diagnosis, yet the medical abnormalities were real. His compromise was to classify Henderson as fit for limited service, which in practice meant assignment to a labor battalion where physical demands would theoretically be controlled and medical supervision available. Henderson accepted this classification without argument, understanding that it at least kept him in the military and opened possibilities that total rejection would have closed. Henderson was inducted into the Army in April 1942 and shipped to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training with the Quartermaster Corps. The Quartermaster Corps was where the Army sent most of its black soldiers, units responsible for supply, transportation, and logistics. The work was essential but invisible, the kind of contribution that history rarely remembers. Henderson spent his first 18 months in uniform loading trucks, organizing supply depots, and performing the endless physical labor that kept the military machine functioning. The work was mind-numbing in its repetition, but Henderson approached it with the same methodical determination he had brought to cotton fields and steel mills. He learned the systems, understood the logistics, saw how supplies moved from ports to depots to frontline units. He observed inefficiencies and mentally catalogued improvements, though he rarely voiced suggestions. A black enlisted man offering tactical advice was unwelcome in the military culture of that time. His unit was stationed in Georgia, then Virginia, then England as the Allied build-up for the invasion of continental Europe accelerated through 1943 and into 1944. During the months in England, Henderson watched infantry units training constantly, practicing beach assaults, urban warfare, defensive maneuvers. He saw white soldiers given opportunities to learn combat skills, to develop the expertise that would be needed for the invasion. Black soldiers in labor battalions received no such training. But Henderson had not traveled thousands of miles from Mississippi to load trucks. He observed the infantry units training around him, white soldiers preparing for combat, while black soldiers were kept in support roles. He began training himself in the early mornings and late evenings, running the obstacle courses that infantry units used, practicing with weapons during any moment when access was possible, studying infantry tactics from manuals he borrowed or purchased with his meager pay. His company commander, Captain Richard Thornton, noticed these unauthorized training sessions. Thornton was a career officer from Virginia who had never questioned the racial segregation he had known his entire life, but he recognized exceptional determination when he saw it. Rather than punish Henderson for training beyond his assigned duties, Thornton began quietly facilitating it, ensuring that ammunition was available for target practice, that training areas were accessible during off hours. Thornton later wrote in his personal journal, discovered decades after the events, "Henderson possesses a quality I cannot fully articulate. He trains as if preparing for a mission that exists only in his mind, with an intensity that shames men who have been designated as warriors. I find myself wondering what he might accomplish if given the opportunity that his skin color denies him. There is something profoundly wrong with a system that wastes such capability based on irrelevant criteria." The opportunity came through catastrophe. In May 1944, with the invasion of France just weeks away, the 29th Infantry Division suffered devastating casualties during a training exercise when live ammunition was accidentally used in what was meant to be a simulation. 19 men were lost, dozens more wounded seriously enough to require evacuation from combat status. The division was suddenly short of infantrymen at the worst possible moment, with the invasion date already set and no time to bring in replacement units from the United States. Desperate measures produced desperate solutions. The division command issued orders allowing for temporary reassignment of qualified personnel from support units to fill infantry vacancies. The qualifications were intentionally vague, designed to pull men from administrative and technical roles. But Thornton saw an opening. He submitted Henderson's name along with documentation of his unauthorized infantry training and his exceptional physical performance scores from the original induction examinations. The reassignment was approved with barely a second glance, just another name on a roster of replacements being processed too quickly for careful scrutiny. Henderson was transferred to Company A, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division in the third week of May 1944. He had less than 2 weeks to integrate with a unit preparing for the most consequential military operation in history. The reception from his new unit was mixed at best. Some soldiers were too focused on their own survival to care about the skin color of the man beside them. Others expressed open hostility to the presence of a black soldier in an infantry unit, a violation of the unwritten rules that governed military culture. There were comments, challenges to his competence, predictions that he would fail under pressure. Henderson responded by outworking everyone, volunteering for the hardest assignments, demonstrating competence so undeniable that it eroded resistance through sheer persistence. Sergeant William Kowalski, Henderson's squad leader, was a Polish immigrant from Detroit who had seen enough prejudice to recognize its stupidity. Kowalski had fled Poland in 1938, had lost family members to the violence that preceded the global conflict. He understood what it meant to be judged by category rather than individual worth. Kowalski evaluated men by their ability to do the job, and within days he concluded that Henderson was among the most capable soldiers under his command. Kowalski assigned Henderson to carry the Browning automatic rifle, a weapon weighing 19 pounds fully loaded that required both physical strength and tactical awareness to employ effectively. The assignment was a statement. Henderson was not being tolerated, he was being relied upon. The Browning automatic rifle was the primary automatic weapon at the squad level, critical for providing suppressive fire and supporting maneuvers. Giving it to Henderson meant trusting him with one of the squad's most important tactical assets. Henderson trained obsessively with the weapon during the remaining days before the invasion. He learned its mechanical operation thoroughly, practiced field stripping and reassembly until he could do it blindfolded. He fired hundreds of rounds, learning the weapon's tendencies, its effective ranges, how to manage the recoil and maintain accuracy. By the time the invasion date arrived, Henderson knew that weapon better than men who had been carrying it for months. The 29th Infantry Division boarded transport ships on June 4, 1944, part of the armada gathering off the southern coast of England. Henderson stood on the deck as the ships moved into the English Channel, watching the coastline fade behind him. He thought about the medical officers who had declared him unfit, the system that had tried to prevent this moment, the long path from Mississippi cotton fields to the largest military operation in history. The irony was not lost on him. He had fought harder to be allowed to fight than many men who had been welcomed into combat roles without question. The weather was terrible. High winds and rough seas forced a delay of the invasion by 24 hours. Men became seasick in the rolling transports, cramped together in holds that smelled of diesel fuel and vomit. Henderson found that his years of physical labor had given him a tolerance for discomfort that served him well. While others suffered, he maintained his equipment, reviewed his tactical assignments, prepared mentally for what was coming. He had learned in the cotton fields and steel mills that enduring discomfort was a skill that could be developed, that the mind could be trained to function despite physical distress. The morning of June 6th arrived with continued poor weather, but a decision that the invasion could not be delayed further. At 0300 hours, Henderson and his unit transferred from the transport ship to the smaller landing craft that would carry them to the beach. The sea was still rough, the landing craft rising and falling sickeningly as they formed up for the run to shore. In the darkness before dawn, Henderson could see the flashes of naval gunfire as Allied battleships and cruisers pounded the German defensive positions along the coast. Company A was assigned to land on Omaha Beach in the second wave, 30 minutes after the initial assault. The plan called for the first wave to secure the beach exits and suppress the defensive positions, allowing the second wave to push inland rapidly. Intelligence had indicated that the German defenses in this sector were moderate, manned by second-rate units with limited combat capability. The naval and aerial bombardment was expected to neutralize most defensive positions before the first soldiers reached the beach. But the plan was collapsing even as Henderson's landing craft approached the shore. The first wave had been devastated. German defensive positions, barely touched by the naval bombardment, poured fire onto the beach. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The German forces in this sector included veteran units with extensive combat experience, and the defensive positions had been constructed with far more sophistication than Allied planners had anticipated. The tidal conditions had caused many landing craft to miss their designated sectors, landing units in areas with no cover and concentrated defenses. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men struggled in the water. The beach was a killing zone, and Henderson's landing craft was heading directly into it. The ramp dropped at 0645 hours. Henderson was positioned fourth in line, directly behind Kowalski. The sound was overwhelming. German machine gun fire, artillery explosions, men shouting orders that could barely be heard over the chaos. The noise was unlike anything Henderson had experienced, a physical force that seemed to compress the air and make breathing difficult. Kowalski stepped off the ramp into water that was chest deep, immediately struggling against the weight of his equipment and the force of the waves. Henderson followed, feeling the cold water shock through his uniform, the weight of his equipment trying to pull him down. The man second in line, a soldier from Ohio named Matthews, went down immediately, disappearing beneath the water. Henderson instinctively reached for him, but Kowalski grabbed his arm, shouting something about keeping moving, that stopping meant dying. Henderson kept moving forward, forcing his legs through the water, focusing on reaching the beach, on surviving the next 10 seconds and then the next 10 after that. The water was thick with obstacles, wooden stakes with mines attached, metal hedgehogs designed to tear open landing craft, barbed wire barely visible beneath the surface. Bodies bumped against him in the surf, some still moving, others already still. The water turned red around him, a sight so surreal that his mind almost refused to process it. He focused on the beach ahead, on the seawall that represented temporary safety, on the immediate task of getting out of the water. He reached the beach and threw himself behind a metal obstacle that offered minimal cover. Bullets struck the sand around him, sending up small geysers. The sound of the bullets hitting the sand was oddly distinct, despite all the other noise. A sharp crack followed by a spray of particles. Kowalski was to his left, yelling something Henderson could not hear over the gunfire. To his right, A young soldier from Iowa named Patterson was trying to dig into the sand with his bare hands, seeking any protection from the fire raking the beach. The beach was approximately 300 yards deep from the waterline to the seawall, 300 yards of open sand with almost no natural cover. Scattered across this killing ground were the members of Company A and a dozen other units, all pinned down by fire from the bluffs overlooking the beach. The German defenders had constructed their positions with devastating effectiveness, reinforced bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, protected by minefields and barbed wire, positioned to maximize the defensive advantage of the high ground. Henderson assessed the situation with a clarity that seemed impossible given the chaos. Years of working under pressure in the steel mills, of maintaining focus despite heat and noise and danger, had trained his mind to function in crisis. He could see the pattern of the defensive fire, identify the positions of the bunkers, understand the tactical geometry that made the beach a perfect killing zone. The beach exits were blocked, the units were disorganized and leaderless, officers and sergeants having been among the first casualties. If the soldiers remained pinned on the beach, the invasion would fail here. The only option was to move forward, to somehow reach and neutralize the defensive positions on the bluffs. He turned to Kowalski and shouted over the noise, "We need to move! Staying here means dying here!" Kowalski nodded, his face grim with the understanding that Henderson was right, but also with the knowledge that moving forward meant almost certain death. But there was no third option. Kowalski began moving along the beach, gathering survivors, organizing them into small groups. Henderson joined this effort, pulling men from their paralysis, creating a sense of purpose and direction in the midst of catastrophe. The decision was made to advance across the beach in small rushes, using smoke from naval shells for concealment, moving from one piece of cover to the next. It was not much of a plan, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. Henderson's group consisted of 8 men, including Kowalski and Patterson. They waited for the next naval salvo to create smoke, then ran forward 30 yards to a slight depression in the sand that offered minimal protection. 2 men went down during that rush, hit by machine gun fire. The remaining 6 reached the depression and pressed themselves into the sand. From this new position, Henderson could see the German bunkers more clearly. There were at least 12 visible positions within the sector his group needed to cross, each one pouring fire onto the beach. The bunkers were constructed with reinforced concrete walls several feet thick, with apertures barely large enough for the machine guns they housed. Standard infantry weapons would be ineffective against such fortifications. They needed engineers with demolition charges, but the engineer units had been scattered and depleted in the landing. Many of the specialized equipment had been lost in the water or destroyed on the beach. Henderson noticed something that the defensive scheme revealed. The bunkers were positioned to fire along the beach, creating interlocking fields of fire that made crossing the open areas impossible. But the positioning also meant that the bunkers had limited ability to fire directly in front of them. If someone could reach the face of a bunker, they would be in a dead zone where the weapons could not depress enough to engage them. It was a design feature intended to prevent close assault, but it also created a vulnerability if someone could actually reach that position. It was a desperate observation, but Henderson was beyond caring about desperate odds. He had spent his entire life being told what he could not do, what was impossible for someone like him. He had proven those limitations wrong through relentless effort and refusal to accept defeat. The bunkers represented just another barrier that others said could not be overcome. He explained his plan to Kowalski. He would advance alone to the first bunker, using speed and the limited dead zones to avoid fire, then use grenades to neutralize the position. Once the first bunker was eliminated, it would create a gap in the defensive fire that others could exploit. Kowalski stared at him for a long moment. "That's suicide," he said flatly. "The moment you move, every gun on that bluff will be on you. You will not make it 20 yards. Henderson shrugged, a gesture of acceptance rather than dismissal. "Maybe," he said, "but we are dying here anyway, just slower. At least this way we might accomplish something. At least this way the invasion continues." There was a long moment where Kowalski seemed to be calculating odds and weighing alternatives. Then he nodded slowly. "Go," he said. "We will provide suppressing fire. Make them keep their heads down. It is not much, but it is what we can do. Henderson checked his grenades, 4 fragmentation grenades and 2 smoke grenades, standard loadout for infantry. He took a deep breath, cleared his mind of everything except the immediate task, and began to move. He sprinted forward, moving at an angle that took him toward the base of the bluff. German fire immediately shifted toward him, bullets kicking up sand around his feet. He zigzagged, changed pace randomly, used every technique he had taught himself in those unauthorized training sessions. The distance seemed impossibly long, 50 yards, then 70, then 100. Every step he expected to feel the impact of bullets, but somehow they missed. His mind was perfectly clear, focused entirely on motion and survival, all fear burned away by pure concentration. He reached the base of the bluff and pressed himself against the earth, breathing hard, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it over the gunfire. Miraculously, impossibly, he had not been hit. The first bunker was 20 feet to his left, its firing aperture directing machine gun fire down onto the beach in a steady rhythm. Henderson pulled a smoke grenade, activated it with hands that were remarkably steady, and threw it in front of the bunker to obscure the defender's vision. Then he moved quickly along the base of the bluff, approaching the bunker from its blind side. The construction was exactly as he had observed from the beach, reinforced concrete with a narrow firing slit, designed to resist artillery, but with limited peripheral vision. He could hear German voices inside, shouting orders in a language he did not understand, but with urgency he recognized universally. Henderson pulled a fragmentation grenade, activated it with the same steady hands, and threw it through the firing aperture in a single smooth motion. He flattened himself against the bunker wall and counted. 1, 2, 3. The explosion inside the bunker was muffled but devastating, the confined space amplifying the effect. The machine gun fire from that position ceased immediately. Henderson did not pause to celebrate or even to verify the result. He moved immediately toward the second bunker, 40 yards further along the bluff. The German defenders in the other positions had seen what happened to the first bunker and were trying to adjust their fire, but the angles and their fixed positions made it difficult to engage him effectively. Every second counted. Henderson used the same approach, smoke grenade for concealment, rapid movement to the blind side, fragmentation grenade through the aperture. The second bunker went silent. Back on the beach, Kowalski and the others watched in disbelief. Henderson was systematically eliminating the defensive positions that had pinned down an entire regiment, moving with speed and precision that seemed superhuman. Kowalski organized his group and began advancing up the bluff, following the path Henderson was clearing. Other groups saw the movement and began doing the same. The paralysis on the beach breaking as soldiers realized that escape was possible, that the defensive line could be breached. Henderson reached the third bunker and repeated the process with mechanical efficiency. His movements were becoming automatic, muscle memory taking over, as adrenaline sustained him beyond normal endurance. Third bunker neutralized. Fourth bunker. He was aware on some level that he was operating beyond normal human capacity, that the combination of exertion and stress should have triggered the medical conditions that had almost kept him out of the military. His heart should be failing, his breathing should have collapsed. But his body continued to function, driven by something deeper than physiology, by a determination so absolute that it overrode physical limitation. The fifth bunker was positioned differently, set back from the bluff edge, with a better field of fire toward its flanks. Henderson could not approach it, using the same method without exposing himself to fire from multiple angles. He studied the position for 30 seconds, his mind racing through alternatives with the same methodical analysis he had applied to steel mill efficiency problems. Then he noticed a shell crater from the naval bombardment, positioned about 20 feet from the bunker. If he could reach the crater, he could throw grenades from there with reasonable accuracy. He sprinted from his current position toward the crater, fully exposed for several seconds. German fire converged on him from multiple positions, bullets striking all around him. He dove into the crater just as rounds struck the ground where he had been a fraction of a second earlier. From the crater he had a clear line to the bunker's firing aperture. He threw 2 grenades in rapid succession, the first to suppress and distract, the second to finish. Both found their mark. The fifth bunker went silent. Kowalski and his group had reached the position where Henderson had eliminated the first bunker. They were pushing inland, engaging German infantry positions that were now exposed with the bunkers neutralized. Other groups were following, and the foothold on the bluff was expanding. But there were still more bunkers operational, and Henderson could see that the German defenders were repositioning to counter the breakthrough. Time was critical. Every minute that passed allowed the defenders to organize a more effective response. The sixth bunker was heavily reinforced, larger than the others, and positioned to command a wide area. Henderson suspected it was a command post as well as a firing position, coordinating the defensive effort. Taking it out would require multiple grenades and perfect execution. He was down to his last 2 fragmentation grenades. He had used the others on the previous bunkers. It would have to be enough. Failure was not an option he was willing to consider. He approached the sixth bunker from below, climbing the steep slope of the bluff using handholds in the grass and earth. The physical exertion was extreme, his arms burning with effort, his lungs struggling for air. But he drove himself upward, refusing to acknowledge the limits of his body. He reached a position level with the bunker and pulled both remaining grenades. He activated them simultaneously and threw them in quick succession through the firing aperture, then dropped flat and covered his head. The explosion was massive, far larger than the previous bunkers. Henderson realized that he must have hit stored ammunition inside the position. The bunker erupted in a secondary explosion that sent debris flying across the bluff, chunks of concrete and twisted metal raining down. When the dust cleared, the sixth bunker was effectively destroyed, its structure compromised, and its defenders eliminated. The explosion had been so powerful that nearby German positions were temporarily shocked into silence. Henderson was out of standard grenades, but he could see 3 more bunkers in this sector, still active and firing on American forces. He had gone too far to stop now, accomplished too much to leave the job unfinished. He began moving toward the 7th bunker, but this time without the advantage of explosive weapons. He picked up a rifle from a fallen German soldier and a bag that contained 3 stick grenades of German design. The irony of using enemy weapons to defeat enemy positions was not lost on him, but war cared nothing for irony. The 7th bunker was engaged with the same tactics, but using German grenades felt strange in his hands. Different weight, different activation mechanism, different throwing dynamics. He adapted quickly, studied the design for 10 seconds, then executed the approach. The German grenades proved effective enough. The 7th bunker fell silent. By now, the breakthrough on the bluff was substantial. American forces were pushing inland across a front of several hundred yards, overwhelming the German defensive line through sheer numbers and determination. Engineers had reached the bluff and were beginning to clear obstacles and establish more organized routes off the beach. But Henderson could see that 2 bunkers in his immediate sector were still operational, and they were directing fire that was preventing the advance from fully exploiting the breakthrough. The 8th bunker was positioned in a way that made direct assault extremely difficult. Henderson studied it and realized that direct assault would be nearly impossible with the resources available to him. But the bunker was constructed partially into the hillside, which meant there might be a rear entrance for the defenders to access and resupply the position. He moved around the position, staying low, using the terrain for concealment. Sure enough, there was a reinforced door at the rear of the bunker, steel construction secured from the inside. Henderson approached the door and listened carefully. He could hear German voices inside, at least 4 or 5 men by his estimate. The door was steel, secured from the inside with what sounded like a heavy bolt mechanism. He examined the hinges. They were external, mounted on the outside of the door frame. This was a design flaw that American forces had noted in intelligence reports, a vulnerability in German defensive construction. Using his rifle as a lever and a rock as a hammer, Henderson began striking the hinge pins, driving them upward out of their sockets. The work was slow and exposed him to potential discovery if German forces passed nearby, but he persisted with the same methodical determination that had characterized everything he had done that day. After several minutes of steady work, the pins were loose enough that he could remove them entirely. The door was now only held by its locking mechanism on the opposite side. Henderson braced himself against the bunker wall, then kicked the door with all his strength. The door, with its hinges removed, fell inward into the bunker. Henderson threw his last German grenade through the opening in the same motion, then rolled away from the entrance. The explosion inside the confined space was devastating, the bunker's own construction amplifying the effect against its defenders. The 8th bunker was neutralized. One bunker remained in Henderson's sector, positioned on the far right of the defensive line. By now, other American units were engaging bunkers across the entire bluff, and the German defensive position was systematically collapsing under the assault. But this 9th bunker was still operational, and Henderson could see that it was preventing advance in a critical area where American forces needed to push inland toward the village of Vierville-sur-Mer, one of the key objectives for the first day of the invasion. Henderson was exhausted beyond anything he had experienced in his life. His hands were bleeding from rough concrete and rocky terrain, the skin torn and raw. His uniform was shredded in places, caked with dirt and smoke residue, and other substances he did not examine too closely. His breathing was labored, each inhalation painful, his lungs burning from exertion and the acrid smoke that hung over the battlefield. But he had come too far to stop with one bunker remaining, accomplished too much to leave the task incomplete. He had no grenades left, no explosives of any kind. Standard infantry weapons would be ineffective against the reinforced concrete. He needed to improvise, to create a weapon from whatever materials were available on the battlefield. He gathered fragments of wood and cloth from debris scattered across the bluff, materials that had once been part of destroyed equipment and structures. He found a jerry can that had contained fuel, damaged in the fighting but still holding perhaps a gallon of gasoline mixed with oil. Henderson created a crude incendiary device, soaking the cloth fragments in the fuel mixture and bundling them with the wood to create mass. It was primitive and dangerous, as likely to harm him as the enemy if handled incorrectly, but it might create enough smoke and fire to drive the defenders out of the bunker or suppress their ability to fight effectively. He had no matches or lighter, but he still had rounds in the German rifle he had picked up. He could create a spark by striking metal against metal, or potentially by discharging a round in a controlled manner. He approached the 9th bunker from the side, using the same dead zone tactics that had worked throughout the morning. The bunker's defenders were focused on targets further down the beach, unaware that Henderson was approaching from their blind side. He prepared his improvised incendiary device, using a strip of cloth as a fuse soaked thoroughly in the fuel mixture. He struck the rifle's bolt against a piece of metal debris repeatedly, creating sparks, until one caught on the fuel-soaked cloth. The fuse began to burn with surprising intensity. Henderson threw the burning device through the firing aperture of the bunker, then immediately moved toward what he hoped was a rear entrance. As smoke began pouring from the bunker's firing slit, thick and black and toxic, the German defenders emerged from a door at the rear, coughing violently and disoriented by the sudden smoke attack. Henderson and a group of American soldiers, who had caught up to his position, engaged them in a brief but intense firefight. The German defenders, caught between the smoke-filled bunker and American forces, quickly surrendered. After securing the prisoners, Henderson confirmed that the 9th bunker was now in American hands. It was 0930 hours on the morning of June 6, 1944. In less than 3 hours since landing on Omaha Beach, Corporal James Henderson had personally neutralized 9 German defensive positions, creating the breakthrough that allowed the 29th Infantry Division to establish a substantial foothold on the bluff and begin pushing inland toward their objectives. His actions had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers and would be documented in multiple after-action reports, filed in the days following the invasion. But in the immediate aftermath, Henderson simply collapsed against the remains of the 9th bunker. His body had finally reached its absolute limit, every reserve of energy depleted, every system pushed beyond sustainable capacity. Kowalski found him there, sitting against the concrete wall, shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion and delayed shock. Kowalski sat down beside him and did not speak for several minutes, both men simply breathing and trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Kowalski broke the silence. "I have never seen anything like what you just did," he said quietly. "In my entire life, in everything I have witnessed, I have never seen one man accomplish what you accomplished in the last 3 hours. No one has." Henderson looked at him, his face hollow with fatigue, his eyes showing the strain of what he had endured. "I just kept moving," he said, his voice hoarse. "If I stopped moving, I would die. So I kept moving forward. That is all I did." Kowalski shook his head slowly. "It was more than that," he insisted. "You gave every man on that beach a reason to believe we could win. You showed them that the defenses could be broken, that determination could overcome preparation. You changed the entire dynamic of the battle. You changed everything." The breakthrough on Omaha Beach remained precarious throughout June 6th and into the following days, but Henderson's actions in the morning hours had created the critical foothold that made Allied success possible. The Omaha sector was the most costly of the 5 invasion beaches, with casualties exceeding 3,000 men in the first day alone. But the invasion succeeded where it might have failed, and the liberation of Western Europe began with that foothold purchased at such tremendous cost. Henderson continued to serve with Company A through the breakout from Normandy in late July, the advance across France through the summer and fall, and into Germany itself in the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945. He participated in the liberation of towns and cities, engaged in combat operations from hedgerow country to urban warfare to final assaults on German positions. He was promoted to sergeant in August 1944, recognition of his tactical competence and leadership capability. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor by both Kowalski and Captain Thornton, with supporting statements from 17 other witnesses who had observed his actions on Omaha Beach. The recommendation was detailed and compelling, documenting the 9 bunkers neutralized, the tactical impact, the courage and initiative displayed under the most extreme conditions. The recommendation was forwarded through channels, processed according to standard procedures, and then disappeared into the military bureaucracy. The disappearance was not accidental. In the military culture of 1944, the idea of awarding the nation's highest military honor to a black soldier was politically and socially complicated. There were concerns about how such recognition would be received, about what messages it would send regarding military integration and racial equality. The recommendation was quietly shelved, a casualty of the same racial prejudice that had tried to keep Henderson out of combat in the first place. Instead, Henderson was awarded the Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor, in a ceremony conducted in October 1944 in a town in eastern France that the division had recently liberated. The citation acknowledged his actions on Omaha Beach, but described them in language that significantly minimized their extraordinary nature, using bureaucratic phrasing that obscured the reality of what he had accomplished. Henderson accepted the medal without complaint or protest, understanding that even this recognition was more than most black soldiers received for comparable actions. The medical conditions that had almost prevented his military service never manifested in the way that the examining doctors had predicted. Military doctors examining him in late 1944, conducting routine medical checks on soldiers who had been in continuous combat, found the same heart murmur that had been present in 1942. They detected the same respiratory irregularities, the same physical characteristics that had led to his classification as unfit for service. But they also found a man who had performed at levels that defied medical explanation, who had endured physical stresses that should have triggered the very conditions that were supposed to disqualify him. One physician, Major Robert Chen, wrote in Henderson's updated medical file, "Subject's performance in combat conditions suggests that current medical evaluation protocols may be inadequate for assessing functional capacity under extreme stress and high motivation. Physical abnormalities documented in initial examination remain detectable, yet subject has performed sustained combat operations at levels exceeding many soldiers without comparable medical limitations. Recommend comprehensive review of classification criteria to better account for psychological and motivational factors in physical performance." That review never happened during the conflict itself, but Henderson's service, along with that of thousands of other black soldiers who had performed with distinction despite the barriers placed in their paths, contributed to the gradual breakdown of military segregation in the years following the end of hostilities. The evidence was undeniable and mounting. Black soldiers could perform in combat roles with distinction when given the opportunity and proper training. The courage and capability had always been present, only the opportunity had been systematically denied. Henderson returned to the United States in November 1945, after the surrender of both Germany and Japan had ended the global conflict. He was 23 years old and had seen more combat than many career soldiers accumulated in entire military lifetimes. The Birmingham steel mill, where he had worked before the conflict, offered him his old job back at his previous wage as if nothing had changed, as if he had not just spent 3 years demonstrating capabilities far beyond loading furnaces and moving materials. Henderson declined the offer. He had discovered through his military service that he was capable of far more than the narrow opportunities that pre-war segregated America had offered him. He had proven to himself and to others that the limitations placed on him were social constructs rather than immutable realities. He was determined to build a life that reflected his actual capabilities rather than accepting the diminished expectations that racial prejudice imposed. Using the educational benefits provided by the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, Henderson enrolled at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to study mechanical engineering. Tuskegee was one of the premier historically black colleges, an institution that had produced generations of black professionals despite operating in a deeply segregated society. The GI Bill provided tuition support and living expenses, creating opportunities for veterans to pursue higher education that would have been financially impossible otherwise. Henderson excelled academically, bringing the same focused determination to his studies that he had applied to everything else in his life. He graduated in 1949 with highest honors and was recruited by an aerospace company in California that was beginning to recognize that talent existed beyond traditional recruitment channels. He became one of the first black engineers in an industry that was just beginning the work that would eventually put human beings on the moon and transform aviation and space exploration. He married in 1951 to Dorothy Williams, a teacher he had met through mutual friends in the small but growing black professional community in Pasadena. They raised 4 children together, 3 daughters and a son, providing them with educational opportunities and expectations of achievement that reflected the changing possibilities in American society. Henderson spoke rarely about his military service to his children when they were young, choosing to focus on the present and future rather than dwelling on the past. His children knew their father had served in the conflict and had been decorated for valor, but they learned the specific details only decades later when researchers investigating the experiences of black combat soldiers in the European theater discovered Henderson's name in declassified after-action reports. The researchers were compiling a comprehensive study of black military service during the conflict, attempting to document contributions that had been systematically minimized in official histories and popular narratives. The researchers found Henderson living in Pasadena in 1996, retired from a 40-year engineering career during which he had contributed to aircraft designs, propulsion systems, and structural innovations that were still in use. They interviewed him extensively over several months, recording dozens of hours of conversations about his experiences from childhood in Mississippi through military service to his professional career. The story that emerged from those interviews revealed layers of significance that went far beyond the individual acts of heroism on Omaha Beach. Henderson described in detail the systematic discrimination he had faced throughout his life, the medical evaluations designed to exclude him from military service, the assumptions about his capabilities based solely on race and physical appearance. But he also described with equal emphasis the moments when individuals had seen past those assumptions and recognized human potential. Thornton facilitating his unauthorized training, Kowalski assigning him the Browning automatic rifle, the division commander approving his transfer to infantry, despite his limited service classification. In a particularly revealing interview session in 1998, Henderson reflected on the complexity of his experiences and feelings. "I was angry for a very long time," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "Angry at the doctors who said I could not fight when I knew I could. Angry at the system that tried to keep me in a labor battalion loading trucks when I was capable of far more. angry at the country that asked me to risk my life while denying me basic rights as a citizen, while treating me as a second-class human being. That anger was real and justified. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I realized over time that anger was not the complete truth of my experience. There were also men like Kowalski and Thornton who believed in me, who gave me chances, who judged me by what I could do rather than what I was supposed to be unable to do according to prejudiced assumptions. The story is not just about discrimination and injustice, though those were absolutely real. It is also about those moments when people transcend their conditioning and see clearly, when they recognize capability regardless of where it appears. The Medal of Honor recommendation that had disappeared in the bureaucracy in 1944 was rediscovered in 1996 during a comprehensive review of military records. The review was part of a broader effort initiated by the Department of Defense to identify cases where minority soldiers had been denied recognition due to racial prejudice. The review process examined thousands of cases, looking for patterns of discrimination in award recommendations and attempting to correct historical injustices. Henderson's case was clear-cut and undeniable. The original recommendation was detailed and compelling, with multiple witnesses providing consistent accounts of his actions. The tactical impact was well documented in after-action reports. The recommendation met every criterion for the Medal of Honor multiple times over. The only explanation for its disappearance was racial prejudice, pure and simple. The review board unanimously recommended that Henderson be awarded the Medal of Honor with appropriate ceremony, recognizing both his valor and the injustice of the decades-long delay. The award was presented to Henderson at a White House ceremony in January 1997, 53 years after the actions it commemorated. He was 74 years old, standing beside President William Clinton in the East Room of the White House, receiving the recognition that should have come in 1944. The ceremony was attended by surviving members of the 29th Infantry Division, including William Kowalski, who was 82 years old and had traveled from Michigan specifically to witness the moment. In his brief remarks at the ceremony, Henderson spoke with characteristic directness and lack of self-aggrandizement. "This medal represents not just my actions on one day in June 1944, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. It represents the service of thousands of black soldiers who fought with courage and distinction and received only partial recognition or no recognition at all. It represents the service of men who proved their capability and their worth, despite a system designed to deny them opportunity. I accept it on behalf of all of them, and I dedicate it to their memory and their contributions." Henderson lived until 2009, reaching the age of 86 and witnessing transformations in American society and race relations that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of his Mississippi childhood. His obituary in the New York Times, published on the front page, described him as a Medal of Honor recipient, aerospace engineer, and civil rights advocate who had lived a life of extraordinary accomplishment despite facing extraordinary obstacles. But the description that would have meant most to Henderson came from William Kowalski, his squad leader on Omaha Beach, who had maintained close friendship and regular correspondence with Henderson for 6 decades. In a letter written shortly before Henderson's death, when both men knew their time was limited, Kowalski wrote, "You were the finest soldier I ever served with in 30 years of military service, and one of the finest men I have ever known in my entire life. You proved that courage cannot be measured in a medical examination, that determination cannot be evaluated on a physical fitness test, and that the human spirit is capable of far more than any system of prejudice can suppress or predict. Your life has been a lesson in what is possible when capability meets opportunity, when prejudice fails to prevent excellence from emerging." The 9 bunkers that Henderson neutralized on June 6, 1944, represented more than tactical objectives on a battlefield, more than obstacles to be overcome in a military operation. They represented barriers that had been declared insurmountable by medical experts who measured bodies but missed spirits, by military policies that assumed racial inferiority, by societal assumptions that limited opportunity based on skin color. Each bunker that fell demonstrated that those barriers were illusions maintained by prejudice, rather than realities imposed by nature. The irony is profound and inescapable. The same military establishment that had tried to exclude Henderson based on his supposed physical limitations had created a situation where his determination and tactical brilliance were essential to the success of the most important military operation of the conflict. The doctors who had declared him unfit for combat had been measuring the wrong things entirely. They had examined his heart and found a murmur, but they had not seen the strength of his will. They had noted his labored breathing, but they had not measured his refusal to quit. They had weighed his slight frame, but they had not assessed the weight he was willing to carry when purpose demanded it. In the decades since the conflict ended, military medical protocols and evaluation procedures have evolved significantly. The understanding of human performance has become more sophisticated, recognizing that physical measurements are only part of a complex equation that includes psychological resilience, determination, adaptability, and motivation. Henderson's service contributed to that evolution, his example forcing reconsideration of assumptions that had seemed self-evident to the medical establishment of his time. The broader impact of Henderson's story extends directly into the civil rights movement that would transform American society in the decades following the end of the conflict. Black veterans like Henderson returned from overseas having proven their courage and capability in the most demanding circumstances that military service could impose. They had risked their lives for a country that denied them basic rights, that subjected them to systematic discrimination and segregation. They were no longer willing to accept that fundamental contradiction between their sacrifices and their treatment. The military service of black soldiers during the global conflict provided moral authority to the demand for equality that was difficult for even the most committed segregationists to dismiss entirely. How could a nation ask men to die for freedom abroad while denying them freedom at home? The question became increasingly difficult to answer, increasingly uncomfortable to confront. Henderson and thousands of veterans like him embodied that question, their very existence challenging the assumptions that undergirded segregation. Henderson himself became actively involved in civil rights advocacy during the 1960s, participating in marches and demonstrations, working on voter registration drives in California communities where discrimination limited black political participation. He brought to that work the same determination he had shown on Omaha Beach, the same absolute refusal to accept that barriers were permanent or that injustice was inevitable. In a particularly memorable speech at a civil rights rally in Los Angeles in 1963, Henderson connected his military experience directly to the ongoing struggle for equality. On that beach in France, he told the crowd, "I learned that what people say is impossible can be achieved through determination and courage. They said I could not fight. I fought anyway. They said the bunkers could not be taken. I took them anyway. The walls of segregation seem strong, just as those concrete bunkers seemed impregnable. But they will fall the same way, through sustained effort and absolute refusal to accept defeat." The story of James Henderson circulated widely among civil rights activists as an example of black capability and courage, a powerful counter-narrative to the stereotypes and assumptions that justified discrimination. His eventual Medal of Honor, awarded in 1997, became a symbol of both achievement and long-delayed justice, a recognition that what had been denied could eventually be claimed, that truth could eventually overcome prejudice. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.